To this video focusing on delegated legislation and in particular orders in council. You will answer 3 questions on delegated legislation in the exam, and the first one is usually about the 3 different forms of delegated legislation: bylaws, orders in council and statutory instruments. So let's look at the type of questions that you might be asked. The first sort is one like this from June 2015, briefly explains statutory instruments and bylaws as forms of delegated legislation. Here you do not get a choice about the type you write about. You have to write about both of these sorts and they're both worth about 5 marks. The second style of question gives all of the sorts of delegated legislation, statutory instruments, bylaws and orders in council, and you are asked to describe 2 of the forms. So i.e. you have to choose. You have a choice, and again each type is worth about 5 marks. The final sort from June 2012 is where they ask you to describe one form for 10 marks. So clearly you'd need to write more about one particular sort. They've also one year they gave you a choice and asked you to write for 10 marks. I would recommend writing about statutory instruments as there is a little bit more to write, and I will deal with this in a separate video. It's really important in these questions that you are completely clear about the difference between primary legislation, shown here at the top, which are acts made by Parliament, and delegated legislation, shown at the bottom, which is bylaws made by local councils and public companies, orders in council made by the Privy Council, and statutory instruments made by government ministers. All of these laws on the lower level are secondary legislation, another name for delegated legislation, and they can only be made under the authority of an enabling act, or parent act sometimes called, passed by Parliament as primary legislation. So the key to a good answer is to define the type of delegated legislation. Make sure you say that it has to be made under the authority of an enabling or parent act. And lastly, give examples using both the parent act and the delegated legislation. These videos choose examples to use, but you will know more examples that you could use, and as long as you name the parent act and the delegated legislation, then those examples will be fine. So let's look at orders in council. So you're going to start with your definition of orders in council. They are laws made by the Privy Council who have been delegated law-making power by Parliament under a parent or enabling act. The Privy Council is a group of senior politicians, both current and former politicians, including the Prime Minister, senior judges and the Queen. Appointments are made by the Queen and are for life. Once you've dealt with who the Privy Council are, have a think about when they meet. They meet once a month, usually at Buckingham Palace. The Queen follows the advice of government ministers in approving orders in council, and orders in council are enforceable in court. Having dealt with your definition and telling the examiner you know who the Privy Council is, you need to move on to your examples. The first is that laws can be made in an emergency when Parliament is not sitting. And an example of this is the Terrorism Order 2001, which was made under the provisions of the United Nations Act 1946, the Parent Act, and made it an offence to provide funds to anyone involved in terrorism. The key points to note here are that you have stated that the order is the order in council, the delegated legislation, and that it has been made under the authority of the United Nations Act, an Act of Parliament, which is the Parent Act. The second example I would recommend is that orders in council are used to transfer responsibilities between government departments or from Westminster to the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments. For example, the Scotland Order 1999, made under the provisions of the Scotland Act 1998, transferred functions to Scottish ministers. Again, you can see that you've been completely clear that you know that the order in council is the Scotland Order 1999 and that the Parent Act or Enabling Act is the Scotland Act 1998. To finish with, I would recommend that you try describing orders in council in 5 minutes, starting with your definition and working your way through to who the Privy Council are, when they meet, and finishing with your 2 examples.